Organ supply. It sounds so simple, just two words. But behind them is one of the most complex and, well, life-altering challenges in modern medicine. We're talking about a real race against time, where the stakes are literally life and death. So let's really dig into what's at the heart of this.
Okay, let's start with a hypothetical story, but one that feels all too real for so many. Picture this. A 32-year-old guy, his whole life ahead of him, and he needs a new kidney. Desperately. His family, his friends, they've done everything. They've raised all the money for the operation, but they've hit a brick wall. Because the one thing money can't buy, the one thing they just can't find, is a donor.
And that story, it perfectly sets up our first section, a life on the line. We're going to use this hypothetical case study to really start to unpack the massive scale of the organ shortage. So let's be super clear here. The problem isn't money, it's not medical skill. We have a young guy, just 32 years old, and his condition is getting worse, fast. The money's been raised, the surgeons are ready to go, but the one missing piece of the puzzle, the most critical part, it's the organ itself. There's just no donor. And yeah, our case is hypothetical, but this exact heartbreaking dilemma, it's the reality for thousands of people, right now, just waiting for that second chance. And that's the thing, isn't it? This isn't just one person's story. It's a window into a huge challenge for all of us, for society. So, what do we do about it? That brings us right to our next section, the urgent question. And really, it all boils down to one single, incredibly important question. What are some possible ways to increase the supply of organs for transplants? It is a tough question, for sure. But for the thousands of people on those waiting lists, the answer is literally the difference between life and death.
All right, so where do we even begin to tackle this? Well, let's start with the system that most of us are probably familiar with. We're calling this section Encouraging the Gift, and we're going to look at all the methods that are based on someone explicitly saying, yes, I want to be a donor.
Now, before we dive into the specifics, there's a really fundamental fact we have to get our heads around, and, well, it's a somber one. The most feasible sources of organs, they come from patients who have just passed away. That one single reality shapes pretty much every policy, every ethical debate we're about to get into. So this brings us to the path of an opt-in donation. It's the system most of us know, and it's basically a four-step journey. First up is education, just getting the word out, letting people know how powerful donation is. Step 2 is declaration. That's when you officially state your wish, like checking that little box on your driver's license. Then hospitals have to have procedures in place to gently ask families. And finally, and this is so important, they always confirm the patient's wishes with the family. It's all about honoring that final choice.
Okay, but what if we came at this from a totally different angle, a complete 180? That leads us right into our next section, a controversial proposal, where we're going to look at a very different and, a pretty highly debated idea, presumed consent. The thinking here, and this is a quote from the source material, is to basically establish a presumption in favor of organ donation after death. But, and this is a huge but, the quote makes it very clear this idea is not universally accepted. The second you start talking about this, you are wading into some very deep, very debated ethical waters.
So what's the big difference between these two systems? Well, it all comes down to the default setting. Think about it this way. With opt-in or explicit consent, the default is no. You are not a donor unless you actively sign up and say you want to be. But with opt-out or presumed consent, the default is yes. You are a donor unless you specifically take steps to say you don't want to be. It is a massive, fundamental shift in thinking.
So what are the arguments for such a controversial idea? Well, people who support it usually point to three main things. First, it's based on the principle of the common good, the idea that what's best for the community as a whole is really important. Second is the simple, practical point that removing organs after someone has passed away, it causes no physical harm. And third, and this is a big one, is the moral argument. Why on earth would we let these incredible, life-saving organs just decompose when they could literally save someone's life?
But this whole conversation isn't just about major organs like hearts and kidneys. There's more to it. So let's widen the lens a bit in this next part. Other avenues for donation.
It's really important to see that we're talking about different kinds of donation here. On one hand, you have complex organs, like a kidney. Getting one of those is logistically a nightmare. It's tough to obtain, preserve, and transport. The solution there? That's about big policy changes and education. But then you have tissues, like blood or a cornea. The logistics are way, way simpler. So the solution for that might be more about aggressive info campaigns and just actively asking people to donate. It really shows there's no one-size-fits-all answer here.
And all of this, it brings us to the really big, profound question that sits at the very heart of this entire topic. This goes way beyond logistics, way beyond policy. It gets right down to our core values as a society. How should a society balance individual choice with the common good in saving lives? How do we weigh a person's individual rights against the desperate need of someone else waiting for an organ? I mean, where do our responsibilities to each other even begin, and where do they end?